Welcome back to Storyteller. Today we are going to listen to some really scary stories. Make sure to subscribe and write down in the comments where are you listening this from. Let's start. James slid his fingers down my waist and tucked them into my back pocket, bending over to kiss me on the cheek. We stood like that, in our freshly manicured front lawn, watching the movers carry our furniture up the front steps and into our new home. In our old apartment, on the outskirts of the city, the furniture had felt large and compact like a can of sardines. It was difficult to even maneuver to the fridge and back. Here, in the suburbs, where every house was a cream-colored cookie-cutter copy of each other, it would feel like dollhouse decor. I took James by the wrist, removing his hand from my backside and giving him a quick smile. Our honeymoon phase hadn't really ever ended, not since we started dating and definitely not since our wedding. I didn't think it ever would. Is this too much? I asked, resting my head on his shoulder. It'll feel so empty with just the two of us. For now, he muttered, and I could feel him smiling. We had never even really discussed starting a family, just because it felt so implied. We could always just read each other's minds like that. I knew he wanted kids as soon as possible, but I also knew he knew I wanted to wait a little longer, and he respected that. It was inevitable, but not a priority. I looked around. I always found neighborhoods like this one a little creepy. They felt simulated and devoid of actual life, but not this one. Somehow, even though the houses were the same, they each felt different. The home to our left appeared empty, with a colorful for sale sign on the lawn, but the one to our right was lively. The windows were adorned with bright pink flowers overflowing from their pots, and the yard was sprinkled with children's toys. Even now there were kids outside, a young boy who appeared around 12 years of age pushing a younger girl on a yellow swing set. Their laughter filled the air. "Hello?" A cheerful voice called, and I turned to see a woman marching towards us with a gleaming smile on her face. She was beautiful and young, maybe around my age, with blonde hair tied up in a pristine ponytail. Her pants fit her perfectly, accentuating her feminine curves, and her blouse was bunched up around her pregnant stomach. I felt myself subconsciously cross my arms, insecure. "Hello," my husband replied, bringing me out of my daze. I realized the woman was holding a dish wrapped in tinfoil and steaming. "You're the new neighbors, I presume?" she asked, her smile only brightening, revealing her perfectly white teeth. "Yes," I said, not wanting her to think I was rude. "I'm Adeline, this is James. We're so excited, this is such a lovely neighborhood." "As are we." My husband and I were so pleased to hear a young couple was moving in. "It really is the perfect place to raise a family," she said knowingly, glancing at her children and then back at us. "Oh, we don't have kids," I said, a nervous laugh bubbling up in my throat. "Oh," she exclaimed. Her smile seemed to falter, but almost as if it were a glitch, it was so brief. She held out the dish in her hands. "Tuna casserole." James took it from her, peeling back some of the foil and taking a whiff. "Smells delicious." "We never caught your name," I said, leaning into my husband's side. "You are." The woman opened her mouth, but no words came out. I waited for her to answer. "Honey," a gruff voice called from the neighbor's doorway. It seemed almost unnaturally loud, not as if he was yelling, but like his voice was amplified somehow. The woman smiled at us again apologetically. "I must be going," she said, resting her hands on her stomach. "We will have to get together sometime." James and I only had the time to nod before she was turning away, walking quickly back towards who I assumed must be her husband. I saw something move on the second floor of their house, baby blue curtains parting. I looked up and met the eyes of two more children. They appeared to be twin girls, maybe 4 or 5. One of them waved. The other just stared. The night felt even more quiet when I stepped outside, almost eerily so. The air felt so heavy and still, like I was standing inside of a painting of a street. My footsteps echoed against the pavement, and I tensed each time another scream rang out from the house. "What the hell?" I muttered, half out of curiosity and half just to hear a human voice. I knocked on the front door 3 times, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. I was already starting to regret coming over here, feeling silly for disturbing their night if it really was nothing. Even their porch was pristine, The white paint looked fresh and even the dolls and toy cars strewn against the railing looked organized. I heard footsteps, and the front door opened a crack. I caught a glimpse of a man's face, his jaw square and dusted with stubble. "Good evening, Adeline," he greeted me. "Hi," I said, my voice coming out far softer than I meant for it to. "Good evening." I thought I heard something. Is everything okay?" He hesitated, then smiled. It looked a little forced. He opened the door wider, and I had to stop myself from flinching. His white button-down was stained with flecks of blood, bright red and fresh. There was a child clinging to his pant leg, a little boy that I didn't recognize. "Everything is all right," he told me, tussling the boy's hair absent-mindedly. "My wife is just going into labor." "Oh," I exclaimed, blinking at him in shock. He seemed incredibly calm, considering the circumstances. "Should we call someone? An ambulance?" "No," he said quickly, his smile fading the tiniest bit. "No, that's quite all right. Thank you for your concern. This isn't her first rodeo, so to speak." He chuckled stiffly. "Oh, okay, well, tell her congratulations." "Will do." He seemed to look me up and down, and a shiver creeped up my spine. "Well, have a lovely night. And we're so happy you moved in." He went to close the door on me, turning away, but at the last second, the little boy shoved his hand through the crack. A piece of notebook paper fluttered to the slats of the porch, and the door closed with a sharp click. I picked up the piece of paper, somewhat stunned, as another scream ricocheted inside my head. I unfolded it slowly, holding it under the porch light and squinting to make out what the shaky scratches of red crayon read. "Mommy makes lots of babies, smiley face." It was only a week later that I got a call on the house phone. I was in the bath, and I ran to the kitchen, a towel wrapped around my waist and my hair dripping warm water down my back. "Hello?" I said into the receiver, clutching the phone with both hands. Somehow I already knew who it would be. "Hello, Adeline." Her voice was just as cheerful as it had been that first day we'd moved in, like a jingling bell hanging from the door of a shop. "How are you, dear?" "I'm fine," I replied, my eyebrows cinching into an involuntary frown. "How are you? How's the baby?" "What?" She sounded genuinely confused, but only for a second. "Oh, the baby is just fine." Such a miracle of life, isn't it? "Yes, such a miracle." "That's amazing. I'm so happy for you." "Yes." "So, listen. I was hoping you and your husband would come by tonight for a little dinner party. I made tuna casserole. Please say you will?" I swallowed. Something about her was beginning to unnerve me, something about how perky she was only days after labor, but I still didn't want to be rude, and it wasn't like I didn't like her. I didn't want to pass up any friends, especially when they lived just next door. "Of course," I said, hoping she could hear my polite smile. "We'll be there." I clutched my Tupperware of cookies tightly to my chest as James guided me up the front steps. I prayed they wouldn't be able to tell they were store-bought, although I was sure they wouldn't say anything even if they did. James knocked on the door, then tooted and picked at some chipped white paint next to the peephole. "Looks like they need a new paint job out here. Maybe I should offer?" "Babe, that's rude," I told him, a strange feeling twisting in my stomach. Something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Our neighbor threw open the door, beaming at us. She was wearing a pink flowery dress and a white apron. "I'm so glad you could make it. Come on in. Everyone's waiting in the dining room." I couldn't help but stare at her stomach, which seemed almost as large as it had been the day we'd met. I glanced at my husband, but he didn't seem to have noticed anything, and only smiled at me reassuringly. Admittedly, I didn't know as much as I could about childbirth, but I knew your stomach stayed large for at least a few days. Surely her body just hadn't recovered yet. Their dining room was larger than ours, or maybe that was just the way it was decorated. It was minimal, the only personal items I could see were more toys. At their long dining table there were 6 places set. A little girl sat at one of them, quietly playing with a Barbie doll, and a teenager sat next to her, scowling at us. I didn't recognize either of them. This couple seemed so young. How could they have a teenager already? Some people started early, I guess. I had assumed a dinner party meant there would be more people, but I felt guilty for assuming that. They were so eager to spend time with us, maybe they just didn't have many other friends, especially with so many children running around. Across from the kids sat her husband, grinning at us. I blinked. He didn't look how I remembered him. Hadn't her husband been a brunette? This man's hair was a lighter brown, almost a dirty blonde, and his face seemed softer. It must have just been the lighting, I told myself. Surely in the dark, his features had just looked bleak and more severe. The woman immediately started bustling around in the kitchen, and James and I took our seats. I stared at the glass of wine already set out in front of me, the dark red liquid reminding me suddenly of that night, of the blood splattered across the man's shirt. James began chatting up the husband, but I couldn't bring myself to keep up. I just stared into the glass, swirling the wine around, watching it lap up against the rim. It was so dark, almost black. We didn't even know these people's names. Were we so rude that we had never asked? Was that a bug? I dipped my finger into my wine and fished out a small fly, still buzzing desperately. Looking around quickly, I flicked it off my finger and to the ground, not wanting to embarrass our hosts. Such a lovely home, James was saying, and I smiled and nodded as if I had been listening. Yes, I butt in, and then hesitated. Forgive me, but I've forgotten your name. The man's grin didn't falter. Joseph, he said happily. No need to apologize. I'm Joseph. And your wife. Dinner is served. The woman called, interrupting me. She wielded a large dish which gave off a faint fishy aroma, setting it down with a flourish in the center of the table. Thank goodness, honey, I'm starving. Joseph tucked his napkin into his shirt and picked up his fork and his knife, clutching them in both hands cartoonishly. I looked at James, searching for any semblance of confusion. I found none, only a polite smile. This is the children's favorite dish, she told us, taking my husband's plate. How many kids do you have? Here you are, love, she said, scooping a helping of casserole onto his plate and reaching over me to set it down in front of him. As she leaned over me, I caught a glimpse of her face. Her skin seemed to glisten around her eyes, like it was wet. Growing boys need to eat. James chuckled nervously, the first hint I'd gotten of anything amiss. That's what I keep telling Adeline. Joseph laughed uproariously, pounding his fists on the table. I caught the teenager jump, and the little girl set down her Barbie, but I couldn't decipher the expression on either of their faces. A man of my own heart. He cried, and he didn't stop laughing. What did you bring us? The woman asked after a moment, nodding at the Tupperware, having to raise her voice to be heard over her husband's laughter. I swallowed. Chocolate chip cookies. Lovely. I gazed down at the food she'd put in front of me. It smelled even fishier up close, nothing like the first one she'd given us. I picked up my fork, picking at a flaky corner. A fish bone stuck to the prongs, long and slender and sharp. I hope you'll eat it all, the woman said to me, leaning over so close her blonde curls tumbled onto my shoulder. She smelled of perfume and faintly of fish. Now that she was close to me, I could see clearly that her face was, in fact, wet. You simply must get used to eating for two. After that dinner, it wasn't that I was avoiding them, but I didn't make much of an effort to get closer. I felt deeply uncomfortable, in a way that I didn't quite like to think about. Even so, I told myself it wasn't them, we just had gotten busy. James had started his new job in the city, starting construction on a new shopping mall, and I had a big interview coming up. I simply didn't have much time to think about our neighbors. Not that they didn't make it difficult not to. Neither of us got much sleep anymore, the sound of a crying baby kept us up, and made us restless. They baffled me during the day, too. One Monday before James had gotten home, I noticed a man out in their yard, playing with a few of the children. He was chasing them around the swings, around and around, and they were shrieking with glee. My curiosity got the better of me. Was this an uncle? A babysitter? I knew little to nothing about this family, and I figured that was what was unnerving me so much. Maybe if I knew more, I would feel comfortable living next to them. Before I could stop myself, I walked out, watching them play for another moment before speaking. "Hi," I called out, and all four of them turned to face me. "Hello. I'm Adeline. I live next door. Sorry to be nosy. I was just wondering, how are you related to the family?" The man smiled at me just like the rest of them, widely. Up close he looked even older, maybe in his 40s. He must be a relative of some sort. "Don't be sorry, Adeline. I'm their son. We've been so happy that you moved in." After that, I put even more distance between myself and the neighbors. I was sure there was a logical explanation for all of this, but if I thought too hard about it, I felt like my brain would explode. A couple of nights later, James had had enough. "That's it," he muttered against my shoulder, squeezing me from behind. "I'm going over there." I groaned, rolling over and pressing our noses together. Even with my eyes crossed, I could see his dark circles, and his hair stuck up wildly from tossing and turning. "Don't, honey," I whispered, my voice raspy. "It's okay, it's not their fault." "Surely they can do something," he argued, gently running his fingers through my hair despite his abrasive tone. "Jesus, it's almost louder with the windows closed. How many babies do they have over there, anyways?" I paused and thought about his question, and I listened. I hadn't realized, but he was right, the crying didn't sound like one infant. It sounded like a whole chorus. "I can do it if you want," I muttered, but he shook his head. "No, it's okay. I'll go. You went last time." He pulled back the covers and got to his feet, reaching for his pants next to the bedside table. I sat up and watched him get dressed, and once he had kissed me and walked downstairs, I stood up to peer blearily through the bedroom window. It was raining that night, the first rain we'd seen since moving in. It made the neighbor's house look much older than it was, almost like a haunted house. In the darkness and the storm, it almost looked dilapidated. I watched my husband tread through the mud, smiling at how goofy he looked carrying our purple umbrella. I watched him march up the front steps, shaking the water off of himself and knocking on the front door. I remember it so vividly. It wasn't a dream. I remember him knocking, and then, so quickly it was unnatural, the front door opened. I didn't see who was behind it, but I saw a bright flash of light and heard a deafening gunshot, and my husband fell to the porch. His chest was eviscerated, blood and guts spewed out on the wood, my husband's warm body still twitching. I remember staring, shaking, in complete shock. I remember seeing curtains parting from the corner of my eye, but I couldn't pull my eyes away from his body. I remember everything going black, like static taking over my vision, and falling. I was surrounded by red meat and blood, and a sticky white substance. I was naked and wet, and I couldn't move, all my limbs were cramped up against my body. I felt a pull, pulling me, sucking me down into the redness and the darkness. I heard a voice, a woman's voice, muffled and distant, screaming and sobbing. "No! I don't want to, please. I don't want any more." I saw a bright light. And I woke up in my bed, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My husband sat up next to me, woken no doubt by my violent cries. He pulled me against my chest, stroking my hair, but I wouldn't stop shaking. It's okay, just a dream." But it wasn't just a dream, I saw it. I had seen him die. It had been so real, so vivid. I was still mourning, still in shock, curled up in his lap. It couldn't have been a dream. She brought me a pie the next day. The wife. James had stayed home from work to console me, deeply alarmed by my reaction to what he thought was just a bad dream. He offered to get the door, but I didn't want him to. I didn't want him anywhere near a front door ever again. I turned the knob with shaking hands. And there she stood, her hair tied up in a messy ponytail, clutching a pie tin in front of her. She was still pregnant. She held it out to me, her smile gleaming and wide but her eyes apologetic. "I wanted to apologize for the noise," she said cheerfully, tilting her head. "I hope it hasn't kept you up. It's just so difficult sometimes with newborns. You of all people would understand." "I don't have kids," I said bluntly, eyeing the pie. "It must have been cherry. It was red, so red." "Remember?" She blinked at me. "Oh, yes, of course." She held out the pie, pushing it into my hands. "Please, take it." I cautiously took it from her. It was so red inside, like the red from my dream. like my husband's guts. When I looked back up, she was still smiling, but there were tears streaming down her face and dripping off her chin. I stared at her blankly. "Are you okay?" "Yes, oh yes. I'm fantastic, dear." Without warning, she opened her arms and pulled me in, hugging me tightly, the pie tin crumbling between us. "We're just so glad you moved in." I heard a sound, like water trickling, and I cringed as something wet touched my legs. I pulled back and looked down to see liquid trickling down her thighs, slightly pink and sticky. She raised her eyebrows inquisitively, then looked down at herself and seemed to blush. "Oh, my. Yes. You must excuse me." She gave me another smile, so wide it looked like it might hurt, still weeping silently. She looked older than before. "I'm so sorry. Again. I'm so sorry." She killed herself a couple of days later. I saw it happen. I felt an urge to look out of our bedroom window around 5 in the morning, and I saw her standing on the roof of the neighbor's house. She seemed to look me right in the eyes before she plummeted. I ran down the stairs as quickly as I could, almost tripping and cracking my head open. When I got outside, everything looked different. The house looked different, old, like it hadn't been lived in years. The yard was overgrown, the grass swallowing up the children's toys, and the pink flowers on the windowsills were shriveled and brown. The porch was dirty and packed with things, as if only hoarders had ever resided there. The paramedics came after I called 911 and the police, and it occurred to me that it was the first time I had seen anyone other than us and the neighbors on that street. They told me it was a good thing I had called, because no one else would have. When I asked what that meant, they just looked at me blankly. "No one else lives here, ma'am," one of them told me, as if it were obvious. I stared at her body until they took her away. She looked different. She looked old. Even so, I could have sworn I saw her stomach growing. I heard them call her Jane Doe as they zipped up the black body bag. That was a few months ago. We moved back into our apartment closer to the city, and even though it's cramped here, it feels so much more comfortable. I've been going to therapy, trying desperately to figure out if what I witnessed was real or pure insanity. My therapist seems to think it was stress. Somehow, so does my husband. As if he wasn't there. As if he didn't see what I did. He seems different. I've noticed things. Like how the mole on the back of his wrist is gone now, and how his hair grows slightly curly when it used to be so straight. I can't get the image of him that night out of my head, his body destroyed and drenched in gore, his eyes still open. I've been throwing up every morning. But I won't test. I'm terrified to confirm what I already know. I was vacationing with my family out in Vancouver when I got the call a week ago. I had been sitting on our hotel room's balcony, overlooking the city, when I suddenly felt my phone buzz. "Jameson here," I said upon answering the call. "Jamie, it's Dylan," my boss replied with a way too chipper tone. "How's the weather out there?" I sighed, catching on immediately that this might not be just a call to check in, and inquired, "Something tells me that you want to know how soon I can get back to work, right?" "I wish it was that simple, Jamie," Dylan let out an exasperated sigh. "You recall how we were discussing the great whites starting to show up in the harbor, right?" "Yeah, what about it?" "We've just recently had a few attacks." His voice rang out through the phone speaker. 10 deaths have been confirmed, 3 of them last night alone. I was initially gonna wait until tomorrow when you and your wife got home, but with how serious things are getting, I need all hands on deck. Alright, she won't be too happy with me leaving her and her parents a day early, but she's been pretty understanding. I sighed, wondering how I was going to bring it up to them. I'll be on the next flight to Halifax as soon as possible. Not long after the call ended, I brought up the news to my wife and in-laws, and with the knowledge that she'd be home the next day, was on a flight to Halifax and arrived home a few hours later. The very next day as I was driving to work, I curiously noted that there was a weather advisory about weather conditions hinting at a possible hurricane in the near future. This caught my attention since Halifax hadn't had a hurricane since a Category 2 hurricane, hit the Atlantic coast in 2003. Nevertheless, I made sure to take caution, having occasionally worked in international waters and understanding that this weather advisory could make the upcoming investigation difficult. If there's one thing I've learned with my career and my family history of serving in the Navy, the ocean is a mysterious and dangerous place that you should never underestimate, for a single mistake out there can cause casualties. I wasn't all too surprised to see the familiar fire, police and ambulance lights as I parked in the Rainbow Beach parking lot and headed towards the beach. Not too long after, I could see Dylan talking to the paramedics, his trademark fishing hat and handlebar mustache making him stand out among the sea of Coast Guard officers, all in uniform and chattering quietly while awaiting instructions. "There's our marine biologist, folks." I could hear my boss call out and saw him wave me over as I approached. "Alrighty, now that's everyone's all here, let's begin." After we were debriefed on the situation, everyone went their separate ways, with a few officers helping the lifeguards change the flags to red ones to indicate to the public that the beach was closed. A few more, along with police officers, were putting up caution tape, fully blocking off the beach. Meanwhile, I had followed Dylan along with a police officer and a paramedic to a particular spot as he turned to me to say, "We just found another body, a college student in his early 20s. He'd actually been missing for a week now, and his corpse washed up to shore an hour ago." Not long after he said this, we had reached our destination and I could see the corpse in question, or rather what was left of it, lying alongside what used to be a yacht. I nearly gagged, the putrid smell of something that's been deceased for a week invading my nostrils. Pushing through the stench, I knelt down to start my part of the investigation. I could tell that there were signs of animals eating away at the corpse over the course of the week the young man had gone missing, but there were two things that stood out and I feel will haunt my nightmares for a few weeks. The first being his eyes, glazed over but holding a look of terror in them. The second was what was most likely the fatal injury itself, a rather large bite mark in the young man's torso, large enough to the point that his left leg was barely attached to his body. I frowned, noticing immediately that something about the bite mark didn't seem right. "Something wrong, Jamie?" Dylan asked, his eyebrows furrowed in concern. "You see the size of this, right?" I inquired back, pointing at the wound. "The bite radius seems a little too big to be your average great white, or any shark in general." "It does look pretty big, true," the older gentleman noted upon closer inspection. "To be fair, there have been a few occasions where a great white can be measured up to 19 feet in length, so we can't entirely rule one out. Plus orcas can get up to a similar length too, if you're thinking this isn't a shark." "I don't know, sir. Great white attacks usually only happen 10 times a year, so finding 11 bodies over the course of a week is a bit strange," I replied as I pulled out my measuring tape to properly measure the wound, being silent for a moment before I continued. "Not to mention, as you recall, I've been in this field for 17 years, sir. Judging by the radius, whatever man-eater we've got, what was the nickname you gave for whatever this is again?" "Bruce." I thought it was fitting. "I'm not surprised," I sighed. "Well, whatever Bruce is, my guess is they're at least 20 feet in length, possibly bigger than that." "Alrighty then, Jamie," Dylan declared, patting me on the shoulder. "Make sure you note down your findings, and then get ready to board one of the boats. Stay safe out there." I gave a nod as the old man walked away, but as I prepared to pull out my notebook, something shiny caught my eye. Looking back at the body, I saw something clenched tightly in the victim's hand. At first I thought it might have been a knife or a piece of the wreck yacht. Barely managing to pry it from his fingers without damaging his body, I realized that this wasn't a piece of metal at all. What I now held and took a moment to examine appeared to be a large aquamarine scale, roughly the size of a license plate. Upon recognizing what it was, I pulled out my notebook on identifying marine life and flipped through it to try to match it with anything in the book. The closest I could get, however, was being able to note that it looked similar in shape to that of a coral snake. As I placed the scale in one of the evidence bags we had, I felt a sense of concern and knew I had to reach out online to any marine biologists. And I picked here because something was definitely off with that scale. I know for a fact that coral snakes aren't that color, and they certainly aren't anywhere the size of whatever killed these people. Ow, fuck. I yelped suddenly, nearly dropping the now bloodied scale that in my foolishness wasn't paying attention to while putting it in the evidence bag and had just cut my hand on. Dropping it fully into the bag and thinking quickly, I made sure to stop the bleeding from the fresh wound before cleaning it as best as I could and bandaging it tightly. "I gotta get someone to check that to make sure it doesn't get infected," I muttered to myself as I stood up with my stuff collected. Well, as carefully as someone with a bandaged hand can. It was just then that the sky opened up and it began to rain. I saw the paramedics heading over with a body bag and figured that I should head out, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination or not, but I could swear I saw a glimpse of something out in the harbor. Curious, I grabbed out my binoculars and looked out towards the ocean, and what I saw filled me with a sense of dread. At first it looked like a large sailboat cutting through the harbor, but something seemed a little off. It took me a moment to realize that the boat was heading out more towards the open ocean, whereas the wind was currently flowing away from the shore and pelting me in the face. Not to mention it was moving in ways that should be impossible for a boat. And it suddenly dawned on me that it wasn't a sailboat at all, but in fact a rather large series of spines making a sail-like fan. It was a pale blue-white, almost translucent. And the part that terrified me the most was its size. This fin looked like a rather large moving island in the distance, way too big to be a shark or whale. And then it was gone. As swiftly as I saw it, the fin descended back into the seawater. There was another thing I noticed too, somehow stranger than seeing the fin. I didn't hear them at first since it was subtle, but I've started to hear a voice in my head. It's androgynous and in a language I don't recognize yet I somehow understand. It's weirdly soothing, calling out to me even longer after I've left the beach, trying to coax me towards the water. I don't know what that's all about, but I didn't hear it until after I cut my hand on the scale. I think I may need to look into this more. Whatever the case, I figured that if there's anywhere I can seek answers for what I saw, it's here. If what I saw is the man-eater my boss is calling Bruce, then I don't think it's a great white that we're dealing with. And the thought of that scares me. It's official, I'm an old man. For the last couple years, I've comforted myself by saying I'm in my early 70s, but math is simple and unforgiving. Today is my 75th birthday, and God, the years do fly. I'm not here for your well wishes, this is hardly a milestone I'm excited about. I'm glad to still be here, of course, but I find I have less and less to live for with every passing year. My bones ache, my kids live far away, and the other side of my bed has been empty for just over 8 months now. In fact, once I cast my vote against that goddamn Trump this November, I may have nothing to live for at all. So spare me your happy birthdays and your congratulations, if you please. I'm here because I have a story for you, and it's one I've never told before. I used to think I kept it inside because it was silly, or maybe because nobody would believe it. I've found, though, that the older you grow, the more exhausting it becomes to lie to yourself. If I'm being perfectly honest, I've never told anybody this story because it scares me, almost to death. But death seems friendlier than it used to, so listen close. The year was 1950, the setting a small town in Maine. I was a boy of 9, rather small for my age, with only one friend in the world to speak of, and his family, seemingly on a whim, decided to move 2,000 miles away. It was shaping up to be the worst summer of my life. My pop wasn't around and my mom was a chore-whore. Boy, was I proud of myself when I came up with that one, so I wasn't apt to hang around the house. With some hesitation, I decided the public library was the place to be that summer. The library's collection of books, particularly children's books, was meager to say the least. But within the walls of that miserly structure, I would find no undone chores, no nagging mother, God rest her soul, and perhaps most importantly, no other children with whom I would be expected to associate. I was the only kid with a low enough social status to spend his precious days of freedom sulking amid the bookshelves, and that was just fine with me. The first half of my summer was even more dreadful than I had imagined it would be. I would sleep in until 10, do my chores, and then ride my bike to the library, and by bike, I mean rusty log of shit attached to a pair of wheels. Once there, I would split my time between unintentionally annoying the elderly patrons and deliberately doing so. One pleasant lady actually interrupted my incessant tongue-clicking to hiss it "shut the fuck up" at me the first time I ever heard a grown-up use the F word. Big fucking deal, I know, but in those days it was unheard of. The dreary days turned to woeful weeks. I had actually begun praying for school to start again until I discovered the basement. I could have sworn I'd roamed every inch of that library, but one day, in the far corner behind the foreign language collection, I stumbled across a small wooden door I had never seen before. That was where it all began. The door was windowless and made from oak that looked far older than the wall in which it rested. It had a knob of black metal that quite literally looked ancient. I wouldn't have been surprised to learn it was crafted in the 17th century. Engraved on the knob was what appeared to be a single footprint. I had the sense that whatever lay beyond this door was forbidden to me, and therefore probably the most interesting thing I would encounter all summer. I quickly glanced around to make sure nobody was watching me, then turned the heavy knob, slipped behind the door, and shut it. There was nothing, only darkness. I took a couple of steps and then stopped, unnerved by the totality of the shadow which surrounded me. I waved my hands in front of me in an attempt to find a wall or a shelf or anything to hold on to. What I actually found was far more subtle, a small string, dangling from above, but far more useful. I grabbed it firmly and pulled it down. Back in the day, lots of light bulbs were operated with strings, and this was one of them. My surroundings were instantly illuminated. I was standing on a small, dusty platform that looked as though it hadn't seen life in quite some time. To my left was a crickety-ass spiral staircase, made of wood and appearing ready to collapse at any second. The bulb was the only source of light in the room, and it was feeble, so when I peered over the railing to see what lay below, the bottom of the staircase dissolved into the darkness. I was beginning to feel scared. This place, wherever I was, seemed to have no business in a town library. It was as though I were in a completely different building. But no 9-year-old likes to let a mystery go unsolved. Looking back, I wish I could tell my prepubescent self to turn around, go back, do anything else besides descending that staircase. You'll be spared a lot of sleepless nights, I'd say. But, of course, I didn't know that then, and I may not have listened even if I had. So instead of turning back, I took a deep breath, gripped the railing, and glared resolutely forward as I began my descent. The wood on the railing was dry and covered with splinters. I immediately let go, holding my hands out for balance as I carefully traversed the staircase. It was, or at least seemed, very long, and with only the dim glow from the string bulb far above me, my heart pounded mercilessly in the darkness. Even kids can sense when something isn't right. I think they just don't always give a shit. By the time my feet reached the cement floor at the bottom, the light from the bulb above was very nearly a memory. But there was a new light source, and God, I'll never forget it. Directly in front of me was a door, massive, and a deep shade of red. The light was coming from behind the door, and it shone out in thin lines from all four sides, a sinister, dimly glowing rectangle. For the second time, I took a deep breath and went through a door I shouldn't have. In contrast to the dank room I entered from, the room behind the door was blinding. When my eyes adjusted, what I saw nearly took my breath away. It was a library. The most perfect library imaginable. I gaped in wonder as I stepped, almost reverently, further into the room. It was beautiful. It was smaller than the library above, much smaller, but it seemed to be almost tailor-made for me. The shelves were packed with brightly colored titles. Both armchairs in the middle of the room were exquisitely comfortable, and the smell, my God, the smell was simply unbelievable. Sort of a mixture of citrus and pine. I simply can't do it justice with words, so I'll suffice it to say that I've never smelled anything better. Not in my 75 years. What was this room? Why had I never heard of it before? Why was nobody else here? Those were the questions I should have been asking. But I was intoxicated. As I gazed around at all the books and basked in the smell of paradise, I could only form one thought: I will never be bored again. In truth, boredom only hid from me for 3 years. It was on my 12th birthday, 63 years ago to this day, that everything changed. Before that day, I visited my basement sanctuary as often as I could, usually several times a week. I never saw another soul down there, yet strangely remained free of suspicion. I never removed a book from that room, but instead would pick up a particular volume wherever I had stopped reading during my previous visit. I sat, always in the same deep purple armchair, and always leaving its twin baron and directly across from myself. That armchair was mine, the other was, well, I suppose I couldn't have articulated it then much better than I can now. But it wasn't mine, that's for damn sure. On my 12th birthday, I arrived later than usual. My mom had invited a couple classmates and some cousins over to our house to celebrate, a gesture which I found more tedious than touching. Really, I just wanted to spend my birthday sitting and reading and smelling paradise. Eventually, our guests went home, and I made it to the library about 15 minutes before closing time. That didn't matter, the workers never checked down there before they locked up. I was free to stay as late as I wished. This particular night, I was devouring the final chapters of an epic adventure: knights, swords, dragons, and the like. I didn't smell it until I read the final words and closed the book. The once exquisite aroma of that room had turned sour. I sat for a moment, unsettled. Objectively, I could recognize that the smell was actually the same as it had been before, that mixture of citrus and pine. I just perceived it differently, and I didn't like it anymore. It was the nasal version of an optical illusion, you know, the one that looks like a young woman glancing backward, but all of a sudden you see that it's really an old woman facing toward you. You can't unsee that, and I couldn't unsmell this. The spell was broken. The odor also seemed, for the first time, to be coming from somewhere specific. With a fair amount of trepidation, I stalked around the room, sniffing the air like a crazed canine until I came to a shelf near the back. The shelf was perfectly normal, with the exception of one title, a large, leather-bound cover of solid faded maroon, with one striking black footprint at the top of the spine. This was the source of the smell. I opened the front cover, and saw one sentence scrawled neatly in blood-red ink atop the first page: "Rest your sorrows down, friend, and leave them where they lie." I stared at this sentence, mesmerized, as I began to retreat to my chair. I turned a page. Blank. The smell became stronger. Another page, blank, and the smell grew stronger still. I stopped for a moment, suppressed a gag, and continued walking. Then, as I neared the armchairs, I turned one final page, and there, in the same sinister print, was the last thing I expected to see: my own name. I dropped the book. I began to sprint toward the door, but as I shifted my gaze forward, my heart leapt to my throat and I stopped in my tracks. The empty chair wasn't empty anymore. An aged man in a suit sat before me, one leg crossed over the other, contemplating me with piercing gray eyes and a light smirk. This was all too much. I fell to my knees and expelled the contents of my stomach onto the carpet. I wiped my mouth, staring at my vomit, when I heard the man let out a chuckle. I stared at him disbelievingly. "Who are you?" I asked, panic in my voice. The man leapt to his feet, grabbed me gently by the shoulders, and helped me to my chair. He sat, once again, in his own. "I fear we got off to a bad start," he said, glancing at the pile of sick on the carpet. "The smell, it does take some getting used to." "Who are you?" I repeated. "Tonight, you will know hardship like you've never before known," he said. "I come as a friend, offering you refuge from it, and from all other storms which lie ahead." I wanted nothing more than to leave at that moment, but I remained seated. I asked him what he was talking about. "Your mother is dead, my boy. By her own hand, in her kitchen." "The scene is gruesome, I must admit," he said in sorrowful tones, but was there a playful glint in his eye? "Surely you wish to avoid this path. I can show you a safer one." My blood ran cold at the horrors this man spoke of, but I did not believe him. "What do you want with me?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. He laughed, an old, raspy yelp that seemed to shake him to his bones. "Nothing but your friendship, dear boy," he said. Then, sensing I found his answer inadequate, he expounded. "I want you to come on a journey with me. My work is noble and you will make a fine apprentice. And maybe, when I'm done," he sighed tiredly, running his bony fingers through his thin white hair, "maybe then, my work can be yours." I stood up, shuffling toward the door but never breaking his gaze. "You're crazy," I told him. "My mom isn't dead. She's not." "See for yourself, if you must," he said, gesturing toward the door. I threw him a contemptuous glare and bolted for the exit. As my hand closed around the knob, he said my name softly. In spite of myself, I turned around. "Your road won't be easy, friend. If it ever becomes too much for you, and I mean ever," he said, pausing to sweep his hand over the room, "you know where to find me." I slammed the door behind me and took the decrepit stairs 2 at a time. I exited the library, clambered onto my bike, and hightailed it home. The front door was wide open. I dismounted, leaving my bike in a heap on the ground, and approached the house cautiously. The old man was lying, he must have been. Still, tears began to sting my eyes. Heart pounding, I stepped inside and called for my mother. I heard no answer, so I turned into the kitchen. To this day, I don't know why she did it. I've lived in that small town in Maine my entire life, although I've kept mostly clear of the public library. Once, in my late 20s, I summoned the courage to step inside. Life was good at that time, and my fear had begun to morph into idle curiosity. Where the door to my basement sanctuary once stood was only a blank wall. I asked the librarian what had become of that basement, though in my heart I knew the answer. "There was no basement," she said. There had never been a basement. In fact, if she had her facts correctly, city zoning ordinances prohibited a basement in the area. I've been haunted by that sickly sweet smell, that poisonous blend of citrus and pine, ever since that long ago birthday. When I saw my mother in the kitchen that day, collapsed in a pool of her own blood, I smelled it. When a man claiming to be my father knocked on my college apartment door, begged me for money and beat me to within an inch of my life when I refused, I smelled it. When my wife miscarried our second child, I smelled it, and again when she miscarried our fourth. When our oldest son got behind the wheel of the family Buick completely shit-faced and got his girlfriend killed, I smelled it. I began to smell it periodically as my wife became sick. She died late last year, and now, I'm alone for the first time in more than half a century. Now, I smell it every day, and it feels like an invitation. A few months ago, I went back to the library and the small oak door with the ancient handle was there right where it used to be. My evening walk has brought me past that library every day since, but I haven't gone inside. Maybe tonight I will. I'm frightened to die, yes, but lately I'm even more frightened to keep living. The old man was right, my road hasn't been easy, and I doubt it will get any easier. Rest your sorrows down, friend, and leave them where they lie. He promised relief. A refuge, he said. Was he right about that too? There's only one way to find out. After all, I still know where to find him,